While locals dismissed it as meaningless chicken scratch, Thomas Bennett knew this wasn't just another forgotten document. A faded, mysterious map tucked away in a crumbling hayloft would lead him to a discovery that defied local history. 8 months of following its cryptic markings led him to unearth something that would change not only his family's legacy, but the entire heritage of Oakridge Valley forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer light filtered through the weathered slats of Thomas Bennett's century-old barn, casting elongated shadows across generations of accumulated farming equipment. Like his father and grandfather before him, Thomas had spent decades working the fertile fields of Oakridge Valley, his calloused hands intimately familiar with every inch of the land that had been in his family since 1895. The Bennett farm had weathered countless storms, both literal and metaphorical, standing as a testament to 3 generations of determined farming in the heart of Iowa's countryside. That July evening started like any other, with Thomas tending to his usual equipment maintenance before sunset. The old John Deere tractor, a reliable companion inherited from his father, had been sputtering lately. As he rummaged through the glutted workshop searching for a specific wrench, the dying sunlight cast an unusual amber glow through the barn's ancient boards, illuminating decades of dust and memories. His fingers brushed against something that felt distinctly different from the cold metal tools he'd grown accustomed to finding. Wedged beneath layers of disused equipment lay a cylindrical metal container, its surface oxidized with age and bearing. The barely discernible initials E.B., Ezekiel Bennett, his grandfather. Thomas almost dismissed it as another piece of obsolete farm equipment, but when he carefully pried open the rusted lid, his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a carefully folded piece of parchment, its edges worn and delicate, covered in intricate handwritten notes and markings he'd never seen before. The date in the corner read 1867, nearly 3 decades before his grandfather had purchased the farm. What appeared to be a detailed map of Oakridge Valley showed landmarks that no longer existed. Old mill sites, forgotten creek beds, strange symbols marking areas across what was now his property, and structures that had long since returned to the earth. But what truly captured Thomas's attention wasn't just the age of the map. It was the carefully drawn X marks and cryptic notations that seemed to outline a deliberate pattern across what was now his eastern acreage. His grandfather had never mentioned anything about a map, let alone one that appeared to mark specific locations across their land with such precise detail. The handwriting was neat but hurried, as if someone had documented something of urgent importance. In the corner of the map, barely legible, was a hastily scrawled note. 9 points mark the path when the summer solstice aligns. Truth lies beneath, whispers from another time. The words were followed by a series of numbers and symbols that made no immediate sense, but something about their arrangement seemed intentional, almost like a code. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he held the map closer to the fading light. He'd heard stories all his life about Oakridge Valley's rich history, tales of pioneer settlements, whispers of Civil War safe houses, and legends of Native American sacred grounds. His grandfather had always said their land held more stories than any history book could tell, but he'd passed away when Thomas was only 12, too young to truly appreciate what that might mean. The map's markings concentrated on his eastern field, an area that had always been particularly challenging to farm. Every summer, the soil there behaved differently from the rest of his land, and certain spots never seemed to yield crops as successfully as others. He'd always attributed it to poor drainage or mineral deficiencies, but now, looking at these mysterious markings, he wondered if there might be another explanation altogether. As darkness settled over the farm, Thomas carefully refolded the map and placed it in his shirt pocket. The tractor repair forgotten, his mind was already racing with possibilities. He'd need to research the map's origins, understand its markings, and somehow make sense of those strange symbols. But more than anything, he needed to keep this discovery quiet until he could verify its significance. Walking back to the farmhouse, Thomas felt a familiar yet strange sensation, the same feeling he'd had as a boy when his grandfather would tell ghost stories on the porch during summer evenings. It was a mixture of excitement and uncertainty, a sense that something extraordinary lay just beneath the surface of the ordinary. Little did he know that this discovery would not only challenge everything he thought he knew about his family's property, but would also put him at odds with many in the community who preferred that some histories remain buried. The simple act of finding this map would set in motion a chain of events that would test his relationships, his resolve, and ultimately his understanding of what it truly means to be a steward of the land. As he stepped onto his porch, the last rays of sunlight disappearing behind the western hills, Thomas made a decision. Tomorrow he would begin to unravel whatever mystery his grandfather's map held, no matter where it might lead. The morning crowd at Caroline's Diner had been a fixture of Oakridge Valley life for as long as anyone could remember. Every day at 7 a.m., local farmers and townspeople would gather around worn wooden tables, sharing news and complaints over steaming mugs of coffee and Caroline's famous apple cinnamon rolls. It was here, the morning after his discovery, that Thomas Bennett made his first mistake, sharing his find. The usual morning chatter died down as Thomas spread the aged map across his regular table, carefully smoothing its creased surface. Around him gathered familiar faces. Henry Wilson, whose dairy farm bordered his property to the north, Eleanor Patel, the town's librarian and local history enthusiast, and old Frank Deerfield, who'd been friends with Thomas's grandfather and seemed to know every story Oakridge Valley had ever generated. "Found this yesterday in my grandfather's old storage container," Thomas explained, his finger tracing the mysterious markings. "It's dated 1867, and look at these symbols. They're marking something specific on what's now my eastern field." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The initial silence was broken by Henry's hearty laugh. "Thomas, my friend, looks like you found yourself some old-timer's treasure map. Probably your grandfather playing games with his brothers back in the day." He took another bite of his cinnamon roll, shaking his head with amusement. Eleanor leaned in closer, her professional interest piqued. "The paper certainly looks period-appropriate," she mused, adjusting her glasses. "But Thomas, you have to understand, if this was something historically significant, it would be in our records. I've catalogued every major historical document related to Oakridge Valley over the past 15 years. Frank Deerfield remained unusually quiet, his weathered face unreadable as he studied the map. When he finally spoke, his words carried an unexpected weight. "Ezekiel never mentioned any map to me, and we shared just about everything." He paused, stirring his coffee slowly. Course, that doesn't mean nothing. Ezekiel had his secrets, like any man. The conversation might have ended there if Victor Palmer hadn't walked in. Victor, the local real estate developer who'd been trying to buy up farmland around Oakridge Valley for his newest housing development, couldn't resist joining the discussion. His expensive suit stood out among the flannel shirts and work boots that filled Caroline's. A mysterious map, Victor's voice carried across the diner, drawing everyone's attention. Let me guess, X marks the spot? The mockery in his tone was thinly veiled. You know, Thomas, if you're having financial trouble, there are more reliable solutions than treasure hunting. My offer to buy your eastern field still stands. Thomas felt his face flush. He'd already turned down Victor's offers twice, knowing the developer planned to turn centuries of farmland into cookie-cutter housing developments with names like Historic Valley Estates and Heritage Fields, ironic titles for neighborhoods that would erase actual history. The land's not for sale, Victor, and this isn't about money. No? Victor raised an eyebrow. Then what's it about? You actually believe your grandfather left you some sort of secret inheritance, hidden civil, or gold, perhaps? His laugh encouraged others to join in, and soon the diner was filled with barely concealed snickers. Eleanor, attempting to be kind, placed a gentle hand on Thomas's arm. Look, I'd be happy to help you research the map's historical context. Maybe we can find out who drew it. It could be a nice piece of family history to frame. Thomas carefully folded the map, his enthusiasm deflating under the weight of their skepticism. He'd expected some doubts, but not this level of dismissal. As he tucked the map back into his pocket, Caroline appeared with a fresh pot of coffee. "Don't let them get to you, honey," she whispered while refilling his cup. "Your grandfather Ezekiel was a smart man. If he kept that map all these years, he had his reasons." But the damage was done. As Thomas left the diner, he could hear Victor's voice carrying over the murmur of conversation. Desperate times make for desperate beliefs. Mark my words, he'll be calling about my offer within the week. Driving back to his farm, Thomas's mind wandered to his grandfather. Ezekiel Bennett had been a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or elaborate jokes. He taught Thomas everything he knew about farming, about reading the land and respecting its history. "Land holds memories," he used to say, "and sometimes it chooses when to share them." Parking his truck by the barn, Thomas pulled out the map again. The morning sun revealed details he hadn't noticed the night before. Tiny numbers next to each X marking, and what appeared to be compass bearings written in faded ink. These weren't random markings or a child's game. They were precise, intentional, and clearly meant to guide someone to something specific. Looking out over his eastern field, Thomas made a decision. The community's mockery had struck a nerve, but it had also strengthened his resolve. He would investigate this properly, methodically, and most importantly, privately. Whatever secrets this map held, he would uncover them without an audience of skeptics. As summer settled over Oakridge Valley, Thomas threw himself into unraveling the map's mystery with methodical determination. His evenings, once spent watching baseball games or catching up on farm paperwork, were now dedicated to poring over old county records and historical documents he'd borrowed from Eleanor at the library, despite her continued skepticism. The breakthrough came on a warm August morning, just as the sun began painting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas had been cross-referencing the map's markings with satellite images of his property when something clicked. The first X on the map aligned perfectly with an unusual depression in his eastern field, a spot where crops had always grown differently and where his tractor always seemed to hit harder ground. Armed with his grandfather's old metal detector and a shovel, Thomas headed out to the spot before dawn. He'd chosen his timing carefully. Victor Palmer had been driving past his property more frequently lately, making barely concealed offers to his neighbors about rescuing failing farmland before the banks do. The last thing Thomas needed was more ammunition for the town's rumor mill. The metal detector's first pass yielded nothing but old nails and bits of farm equipment, but on the second sweep, just as Thomas was about to give up, the device erupted in a series of sharp beeps. His heart racing, he began to dig, carefully, methodically removing layers of soil that had remained undisturbed for decades. 3 feet down, his shovel struck something solid. Dropping to his knees, Thomas brushed away the dirt with trembling hands to reveal a small iron box, its surface corroded with rust, but still intact. The box was sealed with a simple iron clasp, preserved by the dense clay soil that had entombed it. Inside, protected by layers of oiled cloth that had somehow survived the decades, lay a collection of papers and a small leather-bound journal. The papers were yellowed with age, but still legible, bearing dates from the early 1860s. But it was the journal that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. On its first page, in careful script, was written, "Property of Samuel Kingsley, station conductor, Oakridge Valley, 1861-1865. Thomas knew the name Kingsley. It was mentioned in some of the town's oldest records as one of Oakridge Valley's founding families, though they'd left the area mysteriously in the late 1860s. The journal's pages were filled with detailed accounts of daily life. But between mundane observations about weather and crop prices were encrypted entries written in a simple but effective code that used numbers similar to those on the map. As the morning sun climbed higher, Thomas lost himself in the journal's pages. Samuel Kingsley, it seemed, had been more than just a farmer. The encoded entries, once Thomas began to decipher them, using the key thoughtfully included in the back of the journal, revealed a complex network of safe houses and secret routes. Oakridge Valley had been a crucial stop on the Underground Railroad, and the Kingsley farm had helped dozens of enslaved people escape to freedom. The map's markings weren't pointing to buried treasure in the traditional sense. They were marking a series of hidden cellars and tunnels that had been used to shelter people on their journey north. The eastern field, with its mysterious spots of hard ground and poor drainage, had literally been hiding a piece of American history beneath its surface. Thomas sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the implications. His grandfather must have found this map years ago and kept it safe, understanding its historical significance. But why hadn't he shared it? Why leave it for Thomas to discover? The answer came as he reached the journal's final entries. Samuel Kingsley's last encoded message spoke of threats from Confederate sympathizers, of plans to destroy evidence of the network, and of his decision to hide the true records of Oakridge Valley's role in history. The map wasn't just a historical document. It was a carefully preserved secret, protecting both the network's infrastructure and the identities of those who had risked everything to help others find freedom. Found something interesting in that dirt, Thomas? The voice made him jump. Victor Palmer stood at the edge of the field, his polished leather shoes incongruous against the freshly tilled soil. How long had he been watching? Just checking. Some drainage issues, Thomas replied casually, sliding the journal into his jacket pocket. You know how this field gets after a heavy rain. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. Drainage issues. Right. He glanced at the hole Thomas had dug, then back at Thomas's dirt-covered hands. You know my offer still stands. Drainage problems. And all. Save yourself the trouble of whatever this is. He gestured vaguely at the excavation. The land's not for sale, Victor. Not now, not ever. Everything's for sale, Thomas. It's just a matter of price. Victor turned to leave, but paused. By the way, you might want to check the county regulations about unauthorized excavation. Hate to see you get in trouble over drainage issues. As Victor's expensive car disappeared down the dirt road, Thomas looked again at the hole he'd dug, at the iron box that had kept its secrets for so long, and at the map that had started it all. He knew two things with absolute certainty. He had to document everything properly before sharing his discovery, and he couldn't trust anyone in Oakridge Valley just yet. Not even Eleanor Patel with her historical expertise. What Thomas didn't know was that Victor Palmer's interest in his eastern field wasn't just about development opportunities. The Palmer family had its own long history in Oakridge Valley, and some histories, as Thomas would soon discover, were better left undisturbed. The discovery in the eastern field changed everything for Thomas. His nights became filled with careful study of Samuel Kingsley's journal, cross-referencing coded entries with historical records he'd quietly requested from state archives. Each decoded message painted a clearer picture of Oakridge Valley's hidden past, and with it a growing understanding of why some people might prefer this history remain buried. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas managed to locate 2 more iron boxes using the map's markings. Each contained more documents, letters between station conductors, lists of supplies, and most significantly, a detailed ledger of donations from prominent Oakridge Valley families, including some names that still carried weight in the community. But one name stood out: Palmer. According to Kingsley's records, Augustus Palmer, Victor's great-grandfather, had been one of the most vocal opponents of the Underground Railroad network, even leading a group of men who actively worked to expose and destroy safe houses. The ledger contained detailed accounts of his attempts to buy land around suspected routes, much like his great-grandson was doing now. The parallel wasn't lost on Thomas. One morning, as he was transcribing some of Kingsley's coded entries in his kitchen, a knock at his door startled him. Eleanor Patel stood on his porch, looking uncomfortable. "Thomas, we need to talk," she said. "Victor Palmer filed a complaint with the Historical Society. He's claiming you're conducting unauthorized archaeological digs that could damage historically significant farmland." Thomas couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Since when does Victor Palmer care about historical preservation? "This isn't funny," Eleanor replied, her usual composed demeanor cracking slightly. "He's pushing for an immediate investigation. Thomas, if you're really finding something out there, you need to do this properly, through official channels." "Like you all took me seriously before?" The words came out sharper than he intended. "Thomas, this is bigger than just some old map. What exactly have you found?" "Evidence that Oakridge Valley was part of the Underground Railroad. Thomas, every small town in Iowa claims that history. We've never found concrete evidence here because there wasn't any. Whatever you think you've found—" Her voice trailed off as Thomas placed Samuel Kingsley's journal on the table between them. "Read it," he said quietly. "The code key is in the back." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened the journal. Thomas watched her face change as she read, her professional skepticism giving way to growing amazement. "This is... Thomas, if this is authentic, if this is real, it is, and there's more. But some people, influential people, might prefer this stays quiet." Before Eleanor could respond, they heard vehicles pulling up outside. Through the window, Thomas saw 2 county police cars and a black SUV he recognized as Victor Palmer's. "Mr. Bennett!" Victor's voice boomed from outside. "We have a court order to inspect the property for unauthorized excavation and potential historical site degradation." Eleanor's face had gone pale. "Thomas, whatever you found—" "Already ahead of you," he said quickly, gathering the journal and documents. "There's a hidden compartment in the workshop my grandfather built. They won't find it." As Thomas moved to secure the evidence, Eleanor grabbed his arm. "Why didn't you come to me sooner with this? I could have helped." "Would you have believed?" "Me? Really?" The hurt in his voice was evident. "Besides, after what I've learned about certain families' histories here, I'm not sure who to trust anymore." The pounding on the door grew more insistent. Thomas quickly hid the materials and returned to find Eleanor still standing in his kitchen, conflict written across her face. "Your grandfather," she said suddenly. "Ezekiel Bennett. He used to spend hours in the library's archives, especially in the restricted historical documents section. I always wondered what he was researching so intently." Thomas's mind raced. The restricted section. What's in there? Family records mostly, from Oakridge Valley's earliest days. Documents that were sealed by request of the original families. Their eyes met. "Including the Palmers?" The front door opened, revealing Victor Palmer flanked by 2 police officers. His usual smooth smile was firmly in place, but his eyes were cold. "Thomas, Thomas, Thomas," he said, stepping inside uninvited. "All this trouble over drainage issues? My team needs to inspect the eastern field immediately, for historical preservation purposes, of course." "Of course," Thomas replied evenly, noting how Victor's eyes darted around the room, clearly searching for something. "Though I wasn't aware real estate developers had authority in historical preservation matters." Victor's smile tightened. "My family has been in Oakridge Valley for generations, Thomas. We have a vested interest in preserving its accurate history." The emphasis on accurate wasn't subtle. As the police officers headed toward the eastern field, Victor lingered behind. "You know," he said quietly, "my great-grandfather used to say that some doors are better left closed, some stories better left untold. Your grandfather understood that. Smart man, Ezekiel Bennett, knew when to let sleeping dogs lie." The threat was clear, but it only confirmed what Thomas already suspected. He was on the right track, and whatever lay at the end of Kingsley's map had powerful people worried. As Victor followed the officers outside, Eleanor touched Thomas's arm lightly. "The library closes at 8. She whispered. "The restricted section key is kept in my office. Don't make me regret telling you that." That evening, as darkness settled over Oakridge Valley, Thomas discovered that sneaking into the library's restricted section was unnecessary. Eleanor had left the door unlocked and the key to the document cases on her desk. Her silent support gave him hope, but he worked quickly, knowing he couldn't risk being discovered. The restricted section was a small room lined with climate-controlled cases, each filled with leather-bound volumes and carefully preserved documents. In the corner, a filing cabinet labeled "Founding Families" caught his attention. Inside, organized alphabetically, were folders containing the private records of Oakridge Valley's original settlers. The Palmer family file was thick with documents, but it was a thin, unmarked envelope at the back that made Thomas pause. Inside, he found a series of letters between Augustus Palmer and various town officials, dated 1867. The contents made his blood run cold. "The Kingsley situation has been handled," one letter read. "The station conductor and his conspirators will trouble us no more. Their property has been appropriately redistributed among those who understand the proper order of things. Let this serve as a reminder to others who would disturb our community's peace with their dangerous ideals." Another document detailed the redistribution of Kingsley's land, including the very fields Thomas now owned. His grandfather's purchase of the property 60 years later couldn't have been coincidental. Ezekiel Bennett must have known exactly what he was buying and why it mattered. A sudden noise made Thomas freeze. Footsteps echoed in the main library. "Hello, Eleanor? I saw the lights on." Victor Palmer's voice carried through the darkness. Thomas quickly photographed the remaining documents with his phone and carefully returned everything to its place. As Victor's footsteps approached the restricted section, Thomas slipped out through the emergency exit, thanking his grandfather for teaching him every creaky floorboard in the old building during childhood visits. Back home, reviewing the photographs, Thomas found himself connecting dots his grandfather must have uncovered years ago. The Palmer family hadn't just opposed the Underground Railroad, they'd actively worked to destroy evidence of Oakridge Valley's role in it, buying up properties and redistributing land that had been part of the network. But why were they still so interested in keeping this quiet after all these years? The answer came at dawn, in the form of a visitor Thomas hadn't seen in years. Mildred Palmer, Victor's 88-year-old grandmother, stood on his porch, supported by a worn wooden cane. "You're stirring up trouble, boy," she said without preamble, "just like your grandfather before you." Thomas helped her to a chair, noting how her aged eyes kept drifting toward the eastern field. "You knew my grandfather?" "Knew him. I loved him once upon a time, before he discovered the truth about my family, about what my grandfather Augustus did to the Kingsleys and the others. Ezekiel chose his principles over our relationship, chose to buy that cursed land and protect its secrets." "Mrs. Palmer." "Mildred, please. I'm old enough to be done with formalities." She sighed heavily. "Victor doesn't know I'm here. He's so much like Augustus, proud, afraid of change, desperate to protect a family legacy built on shame. But I'm too old to carry these secrets anymore." From her handbag, Mildred withdrew a package wrapped in faded blue cloth. "Your grandfather gave me this for safekeeping years ago. Said if anything ever happened to him, and if you started asking the right questions, I should make sure you got it." Inside the package, Thomas found more coded documents, along with a letter in his grandfather's handwriting. "Dear Thomas," it began, "if you're reading this, you found Kingsley's map and started to understand what really happened here in Oakridge Valley. Mildred will help you. She made her choice long ago, choosing truth over family pride. The final X on the map marks more than just another station point. It marks the evidence Augustus Palmer and his men tried to erase. Evidence of their crimes against those who sought freedom and those who helped them find it. Mildred's voice quavered. Augustus didn't just shut down the Underground Railroad station here. He and his men, they did terrible things to make sure no one would ever find proof of its existence, things my family has been trying to hide ever since. But your grandfather, he found out. That's why Victor's so desperate to buy that land. There are still ruins down there, ruins that tell the true story. Thomas thought of the strange depressions in his eastern field, the areas where nothing would grow quite right. The final X, he said quietly. It doesn't mark a tunnel or a cellar, does it? Mildred shook her head, tears in her eyes. No, child, it's marking a grave, the Kingsley family grave. Augustus didn't just drive them out. He made sure they could never come back to tell their story. Your grandfather spent years trying to find proof, to make things right. Now that task falls to you. The sound of approaching vehicles made them both look up. Through the morning mist, Thomas could see a line of construction equipment moving down his road, Victor Palmer's car in the lead. They'll try to stop you, Mildred said urgently. They'll use the law, money, whatever they can. But that land holds truth that's waited too long to be heard. Your grandfather believed that. So do I. The line of construction equipment advancing down the dirt road looked like an invading army. Through the morning mist, Victor Palmer's black SUV led the procession, followed by 2 bulldozers, an excavator, and several trucks filled with workers. Behind them, a police cruiser's lights flashed silently. They're moving faster than I expected, Mildred said, her aged hands gripping her cane tightly. Victor must have found out I came here. Thomas helped Mildred to her feet. You should go. This could get ugly. No, she said firmly. I've been silent too long. Your grandfather would never forgive me if I abandoned you now. Victor's convoy stopped at the edge of the eastern field. As workers began climbing out of their vehicles, Thomas noticed Eleanor Patel's car speeding up the road, followed by several other vehicles he recognized: Henry Wilson's pickup truck, old Frank Deerfield's ancient Chevy, and at least a dozen other local farmers' vehicles. Victor strode across the field, waving a document. Court order, Thomas. Emergency demolition permit for unsafe ground conditions. Step aside. We're doing this with or without your cooperation. But before he could reach the porch, Eleanor intercepted him, brandishing her own papers. State Historical Society Emergency Protection Order, Victor. I filed it an hour ago. This entire property is now under historical site protection pending investigation. Victor's face reddened. You have no grounds. Actually, Eleanor cut in, we have several grounds, including these. She held up copies of the documents Thomas had photographed the night before. Your family's been sitting on evidence of historical crimes for generations. That ends today. Utum. The gathering crowd of farmers and townspeople moved closer, murmuring among themselves. Thomas spotted Caroline from the diner, Henry Wilson, and even some of the morning coffee regulars who had laughed at him weeks ago. Victor's composure cracked. You can't prove anything. Those documents could be forgeries. This is nothing but an attempt to block legitimate development. They're not forgeries, Victor. Mildred Palmer's voice carried across the suddenly silent crowd. Supporting herself on her cane, she made her way down the porch steps. I signed an affidavit this morning, testifying to everything. The Historical Society has it all. Augustus Palmer's crimes, the covered-up murders, the stolen land. Everything. Victor stared at his grandmother in shock. You betrayed our family." "No, child. I'm trying to save it. There's no honor in hiding evil deeds. Your great-grandfather was a monster who killed innocent people to protect his reputation. Every Palmer since has carried that shame, covered up those crimes. It stops now." As if nature itself was underlining her words, the morning sun broke. Through the mist, illuminating the eastern field, the depressions in the earth that had puzzled farmers for generations now seemed obvious for what they were: the sunken remains of hidden chambers, collapsed tunnels, and one sacred spot marked by the final X on Samuel Kingsley's map. State Historical Society vehicles began arriving, followed by a team of archaeologists Eleanor had contacted. The construction workers, reading the changing situation, began packing up their equipment. Victor Palmer stood alone, watching his carefully maintained facade of respectability crumbling around him. Thomas walked to where Mildred stood facing her grandson. "Mrs. Palmer, Mildred, there's something else you should know. In my grandfather's letter, he wrote about you. Said you were the bravest person he ever knew, choosing truth over family lies. He never stopped loving you." Tears rolled down Mildred's weathered cheeks. "Ezekiel always said the land remembers, child. The earth holds on to its secrets until the right time comes to tell them." She turned to Victor. "It's time to let go of the lies, grandson. Help make this right." For a long moment, Victor stood rigid, generations of pride warring with the weight of truth. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "I'll have my lawyers contact the Historical Society," he said quietly. "There are other documents they should see. Records Augustus kept. I never read them myself, but—" As the crowd dispersed and the archaeological team began their preliminary survey, Thomas found himself standing with Eleanor at the spot marked by the final X. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the ground that had held its secrets for so many years. "Your grandfather would be proud," Eleanor said softly. "He spent years trying to prove what happened here. He knew the truth would come out eventually." Thomas thought of the map that had started it all, carefully preserved in his grandfather's metal container. "He left the map for me to find. He knew someday someone would need to stand up and tell the real story." Mildred Palmer joined them, leaning on her cane. "The land remembers," she repeated, "and now, finally, so will everyone else." As the archaeological team began their careful work, Thomas knew this was just the beginning. Oakridge Valley's true history would finally be told, and with it a measure of justice would come to those who had been silenced so long ago. Samuel Kingsley's map had led to more than just physical evidence. It had unearthed the truth his grandfather had spent years trying to prove. Over the next few weeks, Oakridge Valley became the center of intense historical investigation. The archaeological team worked methodically across Thomas's eastern field, carefully documenting and excavating each site marked on Kingsley's map. Each day brought new discoveries that painted a clearer picture of the town's hidden past. The old morning crowd at Caroline's Diner had transformed. Instead of farm reports and weather forecasts, conversations now centered around the latest findings. Pictures of artifacts lined the diner's walls, and Caroline had started serving Freedom Trail coffee in commemorative mugs bearing the dates of the Underground Railroad operations. "You should see what they found yesterday," Henry Wilson announced one morning, spreading photographs across their usual table. A whole network of reinforced tunnels connecting 3 different safe houses. My great-grandfather must have plowed right over them for years without knowing. The discoveries weren't just physical. As news of the excavation spread, families across the state began coming forward with their own documents, letters, and stories passed down through generations. Eleanor Patel had transformed the library's restricted section into a dedicated research center, where historians worked to piece together the broader narrative of Oakridge Valley's role in the Underground Railroad. But the most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Following through on his promise, Victor Palmer had opened his family's private archives. Hidden in Augustus Palmer's personal safe, they found his detailed journals, dark chronicles that confirmed Mildred's testimony and revealed even more about the extent of his efforts to erase Oakridge Valley's Underground Railroad history. "It's all here," Eleanor explained to Thomas one evening, surrounded by carefully preserved documents in the library's research center. Augustus Palmer didn't just try to destroy the physical evidence. He systematically bought, or threatened, his way into obtaining every piece of documentation he could find. He was creating his own version of history. Thomas picked up one of Augustus's journals, its pages filled with meticulously recorded details of his campaign against the Underground Railroad operators. He documented everything like he was proud of it. Men like Augustus often kept detailed records, Mildred added from her usual spot by the window. She had become a regular presence at the research center, helping historians understand the context of her family's documents. They saw themselves as protecting their way of life. They wanted future generations to know what they'd done. They just never expected those generations to judge them harshly for it. The final location had been left for last, out of respect for what they knew they would find there. When the time came, Thomas insisted on being present. The archaeological team worked with extraordinary care, and their discoveries confirmed the worst of Mildred's account. Hidden beneath decades of accumulated soil, they found the remains of a hidden chamber that had served as both a safe house and ultimately a tomb. Among the artifacts recovered were personal belongings of the Kingsley family, including a final letter from Samuel Kingsley to his wife, warning her to flee with their children while he stayed behind to protect those in his care. The State Historical Commission moved quickly to declare the entire property a protected historical site. Thomas's farmland would now serve a different purpose, preserving and teaching history rather than growing crops. The irony wasn't lost on him that his grandfather had been preparing for this possibility all along. "Found something you might want to see," Frank Deerfield said one morning, arriving at the excavation site with a dusty box from his attic. Inside were dozens of photographs spanning decades, including several of Ezekiel Bennett with Mildred Palmer in their youth. But it was another photo that caught Thomas's attention. Ezekiel standing in the eastern field with Frank, both men holding surveying equipment. "Your grandfather knew what was down there," Frank explained. "We spent years doing unofficial surveys of this field, documenting the ground anomalies. He was building a case, piece by piece, but he wanted to make sure everything was absolutely solid before going public. He knew what he was up against." The photo showed his grandfather looking at the field with an intensity Thomas recognized, the same determination he'd felt when first discovering the map. Ezekiel Bennett had known he might not live to see the truth revealed, but he'd made sure the evidence would be found when the time was right. As autumn turned to winter, Oakridge Valley underwent its own transformation. The town council, led by a coalition of younger members, voted to establish a permanent museum dedicated to telling the complete history of the Underground Railroad in the region. Victor Palmer, in an attempt to make amends, donated a significant portion of his family's wealth to fund educational programs about this crucial period in American history. Mildred Palmer had become a regular speaker at Historical Society events, sharing her family's story as a cautionary tale about the cost of protecting lies and the importance of confronting historical truths. Her relationship with Victor remained strained, but there was a sense that healing had begun. One cold December morning, as Thomas stood in his eastern field, now carefully marked with educational plaques and protected by state historical markers, Eleanor joined him, carrying a folder of newly discovered documents. "You know," she said, "when you first showed me that map, I thought you were chasing fairy tales. I've never been so glad to be wrong." Thomas smiled, thinking of his grandfather's patient determination. "The land remembers," he quoted. "We just have to be willing to listen to its stories." Winter settled over Oakridge Valley like a blank page, covering the archaeological sites with a pristine layer of snow. The transformation of Thomas's farm from agricultural land to historical landmark was nearly complete. Where crops once grew, carefully constructed walkways now led visitors through the preserved sites, each telling a part of the remarkable story that had remained hidden for so long. The morning crowd at Caroline's had evolved into something of an unofficial historical society. Local farmers who once discussed crop yields now debated historical details with visiting scholars, their coffee cups warming hands as they pored over documents and shared family stories that had been passed down through generations. "You know what's remarkable?" Eleanor said one morning, spreading out a new batch of photographs from the ongoing documentation project. "It's not just Oakridge Valley's history we're uncovering. Every week we get calls from other towns across the state, people finding similar patterns, similar stories. Your grandfather's map didn't just unlock our town's secrets, it's encouraging others to look closer at their own histories." The most unexpected development came from the Palmer family archives. As historians continued cataloguing Augustus Palmer's extensive documentation, they discovered connections to Underground Railroad networks stretching from Missouri to Canada. Victor Palmer, still working to redeem his family's legacy, had hired a team of researchers to trace these connections. Augustus's obsession with destroying evidence actually preserved it, Victor explained during a presentation at the newly established Oakridge Valley Historical Center, formerly the town's old grain silo. He was so thorough in documenting what he was trying to erase that he inadvertently created one of the most complete records of Underground Railroad operations in the region. Mildred Palmer, seated in the front row, nodded quietly. Her presence at these events had become a powerful symbol of reconciliation and truth-telling. The local school board had even invited her to help develop a curriculum about the importance of confronting difficult historical truths. One snowy afternoon, as Thomas was helping the archaeological team winterize some of the excavation sites, he received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Marcus Kingsley, a history professor from Chicago and direct descendant of Samuel Kingsley, had traveled to Oakridge Valley after reading about the discoveries. My family never knew exactly what happened, he explained, standing at the site marked by the final X, now protected by a glass enclosure. There were stories, fragments of letters, but the truth was lost to time, or so we thought. What you've uncovered here gives us back our history. He handed Thomas a leather-bound book, Samuel Kingsley's family Bible, passed down through generations. This belongs here, he said, where the story can finally be told completely. The Bible became the centerpiece of a new exhibit about the Kingsley family's role in the Underground Railroad. Its pages contained marginal notes that, when decoded using the same key from the original journal, revealed additional details about the network of brave individuals who risked everything to help others reach freedom. As winter deepened, Thomas spent more time in the converted barn that now served as a research center. The space where he had first discovered the map in his grandfather's metal container had been preserved, with a plaque explaining its significance. Nearby, interactive displays helped visitors understand the complex coding system used in Kingsley's documents. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Thomas found Eleanor working late among stacks of newly donated documents. Local families, inspired by the Palmer family's disclosure, had begun bringing forward their own historical records, letters, diaries, and photographs that had been hidden away for generations. "Look at this," Eleanor said, showing him a faded photograph she'd just uncovered. It showed a group of men standing in front of the old grain silo, dated 1864. Among them was a figure who bore a striking resemblance to Samuel Kingsley, and next to him, shockingly, was a man who could have been Augustus Palmer's twin. They knew each other, Eleanor explained. Before everything happened, according to these letters, they were friends once. Augustus's turn against the Underground Railroad wasn't just about maintaining social order. It was a personal betrayal. The complexity of human relationships revealed in these documents added deeper layers to the story. It wasn't simply a tale of good versus evil, but a complex narrative about choices, loyalty, and the cost of standing up for one's beliefs. Mildred Palmer, who had become something of a grandmother figure to Thomas during these months, often reminded visitors of this complexity. "We're not here to judge the past," she would say during her talks. "We're here to understand it, to learn from it, and to make sure we don't repeat its mistakes." The winter light was fading when Dr. Kingsley made another discovery in his ancestors' Bible, a hidden compartment in the cover containing a daguerreotype of Samuel Kingsley with his family. The image, remarkably preserved, showed them standing in front of the very barn where Thomas had found the map. "The circle closes," Mildred said softly, looking at the image. "Your grandfather knew, Thomas. He knew that someday someone would need to tell this story completely. He made sure you would have everything you needed to do it right." As spring began to thaw the winter frost, Oakridge Valley had become unrecognizable from the quiet farming community it had been just months before. Tour buses regularly rolled down the once empty country roads, bringing visitors from across the country to learn about the town's newly unveiled history. The transformation wasn't just physical. It had touched every aspect of community life. The historical center, under Eleanor Patel's direction, had grown into a full-fledged museum. The main exhibition hall, housed in the renovated grain silo, featured a meticulous recreation of the Underground Railroad network, complete with interactive displays showing how the safe houses and tunnels had operated. But it was the personal, Stories that drew people in, the letters, photographs, and artifacts that brought the history to life. We had another Kingsley descendant visit today. Eleanor told Thomas one morning at Caroline's diner, which had become an unofficial extension of the museum, with Caroline proudly serving as an impromptu historian to curious visitors. This one brought more family papers, including letters from Samuel Kingsley's wife after she fled north with their children. The letters painted a heartbreaking picture of a family torn apart by principle. Rachel Kingsley's writings spoke of sleepless nights, wondering about her husband's fate, of telling their children stories about their father's courage, of building a new life while carrying the weight of uncertainty. Until now, Thomas said quietly, thinking of the evidence they'd uncovered in his eastern field. At least the family finally has answers. Victor Palmer, who had thrown himself into historical research with surprising dedication, had made his own significant discovery. In a hidden compartment of his great-grandfather's desk, he found a confession of sorts, Augustus Palmer's private writings from his final years, filled with remorse for his actions. He knew he'd chosen the wrong side of history, Victor explained during one of the museum's evening lectures. But by then, he felt trapped by his own choices, by the lies he'd built to protect himself and his reputation. His solution was to document everything, perhaps hoping that someday someone would use the truth to make things right. The impact of Oakridge Valley's discoveries rippled outward. Other communities across the state began examining their own histories more closely. Eleanor regularly received calls from historians and historical societies seeking guidance on how to investigate their own Underground Railroad connections. Mildred Palmer had become something of a celebrity in historical preservation circles. Her willingness to confront her family's difficult past had inspired others to do the same. She worked tirelessly with the museum, sharing not only her family story, but also the personal cost of maintaining historical deceptions. "The truth doesn't just set you free," she often said during her presentations. "It gives you a foundation to build something better." One particularly warm spring morning, as Thomas walked the grounds of what had once been his farm, he found Dr. Marcus Kingsley studying the original map in its special display case. The document that had started, everything was now properly preserved, its secrets fully revealed, but its power to inspire unchanged. "You know what amazes me?" Dr. Kingsley said, not looking up from the map. "My great-great-grandfather drew this, hoping someone would find it, understand it, and use it to tell the truth. But he couldn't have imagined how many lives it would touch, how many stories it would unlock." The map had indeed become more than just a historical document. It had become a symbol of how buried truths could surface, how old wounds could heal, and how a community could transform itself by confronting its past honestly. The spring planting season arrived, and for the first time in generations, the eastern field lay undisturbed. Instead of crops, it now nurtured something else. Understanding, reconciliation, and a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human nature. Thomas had initially worried about giving up farming, but he'd found a new purpose in managing the historical site. His knowledge of the land, passed down through generations, proved invaluable in helping visitors understand how the natural features of the property had been used to hide and protect those seeking freedom. One evening, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the preserved sites, Thomas found himself walking with Mildred Palmer along the newly installed memorial pathway. Each step marked a piece of the story. The discovery of the map, the uncovering of the tunnels, the revelation of the truth about Samuel Kingsley's fate. "Your grandfather and I used to walk this same path," Mildred said, her voice soft with memory. "He knew what lay beneath these fields, knew the story had to be told, but he also knew the time had to be right, and the right person had to tell it." "Why didn't he tell it himself?" Thomas asked, a question that had lingered despite all they discovered. Mildred smiled. "Ezekiel understood something important. Some stories need to be discovered, not just told. By finding that map yourself, by choosing to pursue the truth despite everything, you gave this story the power it needed to change things." As they reached the memorial marking the final X, now a solemn tribute to Samuel Kingsley and others who had sacrificed everything for their principles, the last rays of sunlight seemed to illuminate the inscription, "The land remembers, and so shall we." 1 year to the day after Thomas Bennett had first discovered the map in his grandfather's metal container, Oakridge Valley hosted a special commemoration ceremony. The once quiet farming community had been transformed into a nationally recognized historical site, drawing visitors from across the country to learn about its newly revealed past. The ceremony was held in the Eastern Field, where carefully preserved archaeological sites now stood as silent witnesses to the town's hidden history. Rows of chairs filled what had once been fertile farmland, and a podium stood near the glass-enclosed memorial marking Samuel Kingsley's final resting place. Dr. Marcus Kingsley was the keynote speaker, his presence representing a bridge between past and present. "A year ago," he began, "this community made a choice to embrace truth over comfort, understanding over ignorance, and reconciliation over division. My great-great-grandfather's map didn't just lead us to physical locations. It led us to a deeper understanding of who we are and what we can become." The audience included faces both familiar and new. The morning coffee crowd from Caroline's sat together, their usual jokes and banter replaced by respectful attention. Victor Palmer, who had continued his journey of redemption by establishing a foundation for historical truth and reconciliation, sat beside his grandmother Mildred, their relationship slowly healing through shared purpose. Eleanor Patel, now the director of the Oakridge Valley Historical Center, had prepared a special presentation chronicling the year's discoveries. "What began with a single map," she explained, "has sparked a regional renaissance of historical research. We've identified 42 previously unknown Underground Railroad sites across 4 states, all connected to the network that ran through Oakridge Valley." The impact had extended far beyond historical research. The town itself had been revitalized. The influx of visitors had brought new businesses, new opportunities, and new energy to the community. Caroline's Diner had expanded, adding a museum-themed dining room featuring historical photographs and documents. Local farmers had found additional income serving as tour guides, sharing their knowledge of the land and its secrets. But perhaps the most significant change was in the community's understanding of itself. The morning conversations at Caroline's, no longer centered on weather and crop prices alone, they now included discussions of historical responsibility, the importance of preserving truth, and the ongoing work of reconciliation. During the ceremony, Thomas was asked to speak about his grandfather's role in preserving the truth. Standing at the podium, looking out over what had once been his farmland, he felt the weight of the past year's discoveries. My grandfather taught me that farming isn't just about growing crops, he began. It's about being a steward of the land, understanding that we inherit not just soil and seeds, but stories and responsibilities. He knew the truth buried in these fields, and he made sure it would be found when the time was right. Mildred. Palmer followed Thomas at the podium, her voice strong despite her age. A year ago, I was carrying the weight of generations of secrets, she said. Today, I stand here lighter, knowing that the truth, no matter how difficult, is always better than deception. Augustus Palmer tried to bury this history, but in doing so, he actually preserved it for us to find and finally understand. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new permanent exhibition in the converted barn where Thomas had first found the map. The display included not just the original map and Kingsley's journal, but also the accumulated evidence of the past year's discoveries, letters, photographs, artifacts, and documentation that told the full story of Oakridge Valley's role in the Underground Railroad. As the crowd dispersed, Thomas found himself walking the grounds with Dr. Kingsley. They stopped at the final X memorial, where a new plaque had been installed featuring Samuel Kingsley's last letter to his wife, finally delivered to his descendants through the passage of time and truth. "You know," Dr. Kingsley said, "when I first came here, I was looking for closure, an end to a family mystery. Instead, I found a beginning. This isn't just about understanding the past. It's about building a future that honors those who fought for what was right." Later that evening, as the sun set over Oakridge Valley, the usual crowd gathered at Caroline's. The diner had become more than just a local gathering spot. It was now a place where visitors and locals came together to share stories, ask questions, and continue the work of understanding their shared history. Thomas sat at his regular table, now marked with a small plaque, noting it as the spot where he had first shared the map with his skeptical neighbors. Eleanor joined him, carrying a folder of new documents that had recently been donated to the Historical Center. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said, echoing words that had been spoken many times over the past year. Not just of the discoveries, but of how the community has chosen to handle them. Mildred Weber, who had become a regular presence at these evening gatherings, added her own perspective. "Ezekiel always said that the land holds memories, but it's what we do with those memories that matters. Oakridge Valley chose to learn from them, to grow from them, to become better because of them." As Oakridge Valley prepared to mark 18 months since the discovery of Samuel Kingsley's map, the town had settled into its new identity as a place where history lived and breathed. The transformation went far beyond the physical changes to Thomas's former farmland. It had seeped into the very fabric of community life. The Historical Center had expanded its programs to include regular educational workshops, drawing teachers and students from across the country. Eleanor Patel had developed a curriculum that used Oakridge Valley's story to teach broader lessons about historical research, moral courage, and the importance of preserving uncomfortable truths. "It's not just about what happened here," Eleanor explained during one of her popular weekend seminars. "It's about understanding how history gets buried, why it gets buried, and what it takes to bring it back to light." Her words carried special weight in the converted barn where Thomas had first found the map, now serving as the center's main classroom. The impact on the Palmer family had been particularly profound. Victor Palmer, once the town's ambitious developer had transformed his real estate business into a historical preservation company. His firm now specialized in identifying and protecting potential historical sites, using the lessons learned from Oakridge Valley as a guide. "Sometimes the most valuable development is preservation," Victor often said, the irony of his transformation not lost on anyone who remembered his initial resistance to Thomas's discoveries. His grandmother Mildred would smile quietly during these moments, her faith in family redemption justified. "It's surreal," Thomas admitted to Eleanor as they watched a crew setting up equipment near the memorial garden. "3 years ago, I was just trying to fix a tractor. Now we're about to be on national television." The documentary team spent weeks interviewing everyone involved in the story. They started with Thomas finding the map in his grandfather's metal container, but quickly discovered that every person in Oakridge Valley had their own perspective on how the revelations had changed their lives and their community. Caroline's diner became the unofficial production headquarters, with the crew particularly fascinated by how the morning coffee crowd had evolved from skeptics to passionate historians. They filmed hours of footage capturing the regular discussions that now took place around those worn wooden tables. "You should have seen their faces when I first brought in that map," Thomas recalled during his interview, sitting at the same table where he'd faced mockery 3 years earlier. Now these same people are leading tours and teaching visitors about the Underground Railroad. The presence of the documentary crew coincided with another significant development. The National Historic Preservation Board had voted unanimously to designate Oakridge Valley as a National Historic Landmark, recognizing its unique contribution to understanding and preserving Underground Railroad history. This designation isn't just about what happened here in the past, Eleanor explained during the official ceremony. It's about how this community chose to handle difficult historical truths in the present. Oakridge Valley has become a model for how communities can engage with challenging aspects of their history. Mildred Palmer's interview for the documentary became one of its most powerful segments. At 91, her voice still carried the weight of authority as she spoke about her family's journey from hiding the truth to championing its revelation. "Augustus Palmer thought he could bury history," she said, sitting in the garden that bore her family's name. "But he actually preserved it, waiting for the right time and the right people to bring it into the light. That's the thing about truth. It's patient. It can wait generations if it needs to." Victor Palmer's transformation had caught the documentary team's particular interest. They filmed him leading a workshop for other communities facing similar historical reckonings, sharing how his initial resistance had evolved into passionate advocacy. "I used to think preserving my family's reputation meant hiding our past," he told the cameras. "Now I understand that real honor comes from acknowledging mistakes and working to make them right." Dr. Marcus Kingsley had brought a team of graduate students to Oakridge Valley during the filming. Their research project focused on documenting the broader impact of the town's discoveries, which had revealed connections to Underground Railroad sites as far away as Michigan and Canada. "What started with one map in a metal container," he explained during his interview, "has literally rewritten our understanding of how the Underground Railroad operated in this region. But more importantly, it's shown us how communities can heal from historical trauma through honest confrontation with the past." The documentary crew spent considerable time at the historical center, now a state-of-the-art facility that welcomed researchers and visitors from around the world. Eleanor had developed innovative programs that combined historical research with community engagement, creating a model that other institutions were eager to follow. "We're not just preserving artifacts," she told the filmmakers. "We're preserving lessons about courage, truth, and reconciliation. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence tells a story about choices people made, both in the past and in how we deal with that past today." One morning, as the crew filmed sunrise over the preserved archaeological sites, Thomas found himself walking the grounds with Frank Deerfield. The elderly farmer had become one of the town's most popular tour guides, his deep knowledge of local history enhanced by personal memories of Ezekiel Bennett. "Your grandfather would get a kick out of all this," Frank said, gesturing at the cameras. "He never wanted recognition. He just wanted the truth to come out when the time was right. But I think he'd be proud of how Oakridge Valley has handled it." The documentary's presence had brought fresh attention to ongoing research efforts. New documents continued to surface as other communities, inspired by Oakridge Valley's example, began examining their own history more carefully. Each new discovery added another piece to the puzzle of how the Underground Railroad had operated, revealing a more complex and extensive network than historians had previously understood. Mildred Palmer, watching the crew pack up their equipment, after weeks of filming, shared a final observation that would become the documentary's closing quote. "Some people think revealing difficult truths divides communities. Oakridge Valley proves the opposite. When you face history honestly, when you acknowledge both the dark and the light, you create something stronger than silence ever could." The national broadcast of "The Map That Changed Everything" marked another turning point for Oakridge Valley. The documentary had captured not just the historical significance of the discoveries, but the profound personal transformations that had reshaped the community. In its wake came a flood of correspondence from across the country. Letters, emails, and phone calls from people inspired to examine their own family histories and community stories. But it was a letter from Canada that would lead to the most remarkable personal revelation yet. Rebecca Thompson, a historian from Toronto, had watched the documentary and recognized similarities between Oakridge Valley's tunnel systems and those she'd been researching in Ontario. Her subsequent visit would unlock another layer of the Kingsley family story. "Look at this," she said, spreading documents across a table at the historical center. "I've been tracking the paths of families who made it to Canada through the Underground Railroad. There are multiple references to a Kingsley station in Ontario, established by Rachel Kingsley and her children after they fled north." Eleanor Patel, who had been cataloguing every piece of information about the Kingsley family, immediately recognized the significance. So Samuel Kingsley's family didn't just escape. They continued his work from Canada. The discovery sparked a new round of research. Dr. Kingsley flew in from Chicago, bringing with him family documents that had never made sense until now. Together with Rebecca's research, they painted a picture of how the Kingsley family's commitment to helping others had continued long after they left Oakridge Valley. "My great-great-grandmother never stopped hoping she'd learn what happened to her husband," Dr. Kingsley explained during a special presentation at the Historical Center. "But she honored his memory by creating a safe haven for others, making the same journey he had helped so many undertake." Mildred Palmer, listening from her usual seat in the front row, wiped tears from her eyes. "All those years my family spent trying to erase this history," she said softly, and here was this whole other chapter being written in Canada. The truth really does find its way out. The Canadian connection led to another surprising discovery. Among Rebecca Thompson's documents was a series of letters between Rachel Kingsley and a Palmer, not Augustus, but his younger sister Catherine, who had secretly maintained correspondence with the Kingsley family for years after they fled north. She was the conscience of the Palmer family, Victor explained, reading his great-great-aunt's letters with visible emotion. While my great-grandfather was trying to bury the truth, his sister was preserving it through these letters. She knew someday they would matter. The letters revealed that Catherine Palmer had played a crucial role in protecting evidence of Oakridge Valley's Underground Railroad history. She had created duplicate records of her brother's documentation, sensing that his obsessive recording of what he was trying to destroy might someday prove vital. For Thomas, these revelations brought a deeper understanding of his grandfather's actions. Ezekiel Bennett had clearly known about Catherine Palmer's role. His careful preservation of the map and other documents followed the same pattern she had established decades earlier. Your grandfather was part of a long line of truth keepers, Mildred told Thomas one evening at Caroline's. People who understood that some stories need to be protected until the right time comes to tell them. The personal impact of these discoveries rippled through the community. Local families, inspired by the Kingsley and Palmer stories, began sharing their own hidden histories. The Historical Center created a new program called Truth Keepers, dedicated to collecting and preserving family stories that intersected with Oakridge Valley's Underground Railroad history. Caroline's Diner installed a new display case featuring photographs and documents from local families, each telling a piece of the larger story. The morning coffee crowd now included regular visits from people sharing newly discovered family, letters, photographs, and memories. It's like the whole town is finally having one big honest conversation about its past, Caroline observed, serving coffee to a group of visitors examining the display. And wouldn't you know it, instead of tearing us apart like some feared, it's brought us closer together. The effect on the younger generation was particularly noteworthy. Local schools had incorporated Oakridge Valley's story into their curriculum, teaching students about the importance of historical truth and moral courage. The Kingsley and Palmer stories became powerful examples of how families could choose to confront and learn from difficult aspects of their history. Victor Palmer, continuing his journey of redemption, established a scholarship fund for students interested in historical research and preservation. The first recipient was a young woman whose family had recently discovered their own connections to the Underground Railroad network. "We're not just preserving history," Victor explained during the scholarship announcement. "We're creating a new generation of truth keepers, people who understand that honest confrontation with the past is the key to building a better future." As autumn approached again, Thomas found himself increasingly reflecting on how personal truths had transformed his community. The farm he had once worked for crops now yielded a different kind of harvest: understanding, reconciliation, and healing. 5 years to the day after Thomas Bennett first discovered the map in his grandfather's metal container, Oakridge Valley had become more than just a historical site or a model for community reconciliation. It had become a beacon of hope for communities struggling with their own hidden histories. The morning sun rose over a landscape transformed not just physically but spiritually, Where crops once grew, paths now wound through carefully preserved historical sites, each telling a piece of a story that had waited generations to be told. The old barn where the map was found had become the heart of a living museum, its weathered beams bearing witness to how truth, once revealed, could transform everything it touched. 5 years, Thomas mused, standing in the doorway of the barn during the anniversary commemoration. Sometimes it feels like yesterday I was just looking for a wrench to fix my tractor. Eleanor Patel, now nationally recognized for her work in historical preservation, joined him. And sometimes it feels like this is how Oakridge Valley was always meant to be, like everything before was just preparing for this moment. The anniversary celebration brought together faces both familiar and new. Dr. Marcus Kingsley had come with several generations of his family, including young children who would grow up knowing their ancestors' true story. The Palmer family, led by Mildred and Victor, represented how confronting difficult truths could lead to healing and growth. Caroline's Diner hosted a special breakfast where the morning regulars who had once mocked Thomas's discovery shared their own journeys of understanding. Frank Deerfield, his voice thick with emotion, raised his coffee cup in a toast to Ezekiel Bennett, who knew that some seeds take generations to grow. Noni Steeker. The day's ceremonies included the dedication of a new educational center built with funds from the Palmer Foundation for Historical Truth. Inside, interactive exhibits told not just the story of Oakridge Valley's Underground Railroad history, but also how the community had chosen to handle the discovery of that history. "The most important lesson we can teach," Mildred Palmer said during the dedication, "is that it's never too late to choose truth over comfort, understanding over ignorance, reconciliation over division." The impact of Oakridge Valley's transformation had spread far beyond its borders. Dozens of other communities had followed its example, uncovering and confronting their own hidden histories. The Oakridge Valley model had become a template for how communities could engage with difficult aspects of their past while building stronger bonds in the present. Victor Palmer, standing at the podium where he had once tried to dismiss Thomas's discoveries, addressed the gathering with hard-won wisdom. "5 years ago, I thought I was protecting my family's legacy by trying to keep the past buried. Now I understand that our true legacy is in how we choose to face that past and learn from it." As evening approached, Thomas found himself walking the grounds with Eleanor and Mildred. They stopped at the memorial marking Samuel Kingsley's final resting place, now surrounded by a garden that bloomed in every season. "You know what your grandfather told me once?" Mildred said, her aged hand resting on the memorial. "He said that land holds memories, not just of what we plant, but of who we are and what we choose to do. He believed that someday Oakridge Valley would need to know its true story to understand itself." Eleanor nodded, thinking of all the documents and artifacts now preserved in the historical center. "And now we're helping other communities understand their stories too. Every week we get requests for guidance from towns discovering their own hidden histories." The setting sun cast long shadows across the preserved sites, much as it had on the evening Thomas first found the map. But now these shadows seemed less like secrets waiting to be uncovered, and more like connections reaching out across time, linking past to present, truth to reconciliation. "The land remembers," Thomas said softly, echoing his grandfather's words. "But it's what we do with those memories that matters." As darkness fell, The lights of the historical center glowed warmly, welcoming a new group of visitors eager to learn from Oakridge Valley's example. Inside, displays told the story of a map that had changed everything, not just by revealing hidden history, but by showing how a community could grow stronger through honest confrontation with its past. In the end, Oakridge Valley's story wasn't just about what was discovered beneath its soil. It was about how truth, when finally allowed to surface, could transform not just a place, but the hearts and minds of those who called it home. The map that Thomas found in his grandfather's metal container had led not just to physical locations, but to a deeper understanding of how communities could heal, grow, and build a better future by honestly facing their past. As the anniversary celebration drew to a close, Thomas stood once more in the old barn where it all began. The map, now carefully preserved behind glass, seemed to glow in the evening light, a reminder that some treasures are measured not in gold or silver, but in the truths they help us find and the healing they make possible. The story of Oakridge Valley continues to unfold, a living testament to the power of truth and the courage to face it. And somewhere, Thomas liked to think, his grandfather was smiling, knowing that the seeds of truth he had so carefully preserved had finally grown into something beautiful and lasting. 10 years after Thomas Bennett first discovered the mysterious map in his grandfather's metal container, Oakridge Valley had evolved beyond anyone's expectations. What began as a simple farm had blossomed into a nationally renowned center for historical truth and reconciliation, drawing scholars, activists, and ordinary citizens from around the world who sought to understand how confronting painful histories could heal communities. The 10th anniversary celebration was unlike anything the town had ever hosted. The grounds of the Oakridge Valley Historical Center were adorned with photographs documenting the journey, from Thomas's initial discovery to the groundbreaking archaeological finds, the documentary filming, and the countless lives touched by the revelations that followed. "A decade ago, I thought I was just fixing a tractor," Thomas joked to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying across what had once been his eastern field. "Instead, I discovered that sometimes the most important things we cultivate aren't crops, they're truths." At 52, Thomas had grown into his role as the center's director. The reluctant farmer had become a passionate advocate for what he called the archaeology of truth, the careful, deliberate unearthing of buried histories that communities had tried to forget. Dr. Marcus Kingsley, now the chair of African American Studies at Northwestern University, delivered the keynote address from the same podium where 10 years earlier he had first spoken about his ancestor. "When I first came to Oakridge Valley, I was seeking closure for my family," he began, surveying the hundreds of faces before him. "What I found instead was an opening, a door into not just our past, but our collective future." Samuel Kingsley's map didn't just mark secret tunnels and safe houses, it charted a course for how we might navigate the most difficult terrain of all, our shared history. The celebration was as much about the future as the past. The Kingsley Palmer Truth Initiative, jointly founded by Dr. Kingsley and Victor Palmer 5 years earlier, had helped 23 communities across America uncover and reconcile with their own hidden histories. From sundown towns in Oregon to massacre sites in Oklahoma. The template that emerged here, Victor explained during a panel discussion, wasn't just about finding historical artifacts. It was about creating a process where truth could emerge safely, where communities could face difficult facts without fracturing, where acknowledgement could lead to genuine healing. At 96, Mildred Palmer attended in a wheelchair, her body frail but her mind sharp as ever. When asked by a young journalist what had sustained her through the decade of difficult revelations, she smiled. "The truth is like oxygen," she replied. "At first it can burn if you've been without it too long, but soon enough you realize you can't live without it." The crowd that gathered included not just local residents and historians, but representatives from communities that had followed Oakridge Valley's example. Mayor Sophia Williams from Lakeside, Minnesota, shared how her town had uncovered its history of displacing indigenous communities. Pastor James Washington, from Millfield, Georgia, described his congregation's work, documenting lynchings that local histories had erased. "What Oakridge Valley gave us wasn't just inspiration," Pastor Washington said, his deep voice resonating through the hall. "It was a roadmap. It showed that reconciliation isn't just possible, it's practical." The original map that had started everything now held a place of honor in the center's main exhibition hall. Protected in a custom-designed case, it drew visitors who often stood silently before it, contemplating how a single document, hidden for generations, could transform an entire community. "People ask me all the time what makes this map special," Eleanor Patel told a group of educators during a special tour. "The truth is, there's nothing magical about this piece of paper. What's remarkable is what happened when one person, Thomas, chose to follow where it led, even when that path became difficult." Eleanor, now in her 60s, had published 3 books on historical reconciliation. Her methods for community-based truth-telling had been adopted by historical societies across the country. What she called the Oakridge approach emphasized that historical discovery without community transformation was merely academic exercise. "History isn't just what happened," she would tell her students. "It's what we choose to do with what happened." The 10th anniversary coincided with the completion of the most ambitious undertaking yet, a comprehensive digital mapping of every known Underground Railroad site in the Midwest, connected through an interactive database that allowed researchers to trace routes, identify patterns, and understand the complex network that had helped thousands escape to freedom. This project would have been unimaginable 10 years ago, Dr. Rebecca Thompson explained as she demonstrated the system. Now the director of Underground Railroad Studies at the University of Toronto, she had devoted her career to connecting the scattered pieces of this historical puzzle. Before Oakridge Valley, we had fragments, individual stories, isolated sites. Now we have a tapestry. We can see not just what happened, but how it happened, who made it possible, and why it matters today. The digital archive included thousands of documents, photographs, and oral histories collected from communities that had participated in the Kingsley Palmer Initiative. Among the most powerful were video testimonies from descendants of both those who had escaped slavery and those who had helped them, as well as from families like the Palmers, who had worked to erase that history. What makes this archive unique, Rebecca continued, is that it doesn't just document the past. It documents the process of discovering the past, the resistance, the breakthroughs, the reconciliation. It shows communities not just what happened 150 years ago, but what happened when they faced those truths in the present. As sunset approached on the final day of the celebration, attendees gathered for what had become a tradition, a twilight walk through the preserved archaeological sites, now enhanced with subtle lighting that illuminated the key features, while respecting the solemnity of places like Samuel Kingsley's final resting place. Thomas led the procession, walking slowly alongside Mildred's wheelchair, which Victor pushed. With gentle care, the three of them, Bennett, Palmer, represented the unlikely alliance that had made everything possible: the truth seeker, the truth keeper, and the one who had learned that real legacy comes from honesty, not concealment. "You know what strikes me most about tonight?" Mildred said, as they paused by the memorial garden. "Look at these young people." She gestured toward the groups of students and young professionals who had come from across the country. They're not afraid of difficult truths. They're eager for them. That's the real change. "The next generation," Victor agreed, watching his own grandchildren walking ahead with Dr. Kingsley's family. "They're growing up with a different relationship to history." Thomas nodded, remembering how different his own relationship with the past had been before finding the map. "They understand something we had to learn the hard way, that burying history doesn't make it disappear. It just forces it to find another way to the surface." Back at Caroline's Diner, now a historic landmark in its own right, the evening concluded with an informal gathering that mirrored the morning coffee sessions where Thomas had first shared his discovery. Caroline herself, now in her 70s but still making the best apple cinnamon rolls in the county, had prepared a special menu featuring dishes that told the story of the Underground Railroad, foods that had sustained travelers on their journey north. "This isn't just a meal," she explained to the crowded diner. "It's memory made tangible. It's history you can taste." As conversations flowed around the room, Thomas found himself sitting with Eleanor and Frank Deerfield, now 92, but still sharp as a tack. They occupied the same table where, as a decade earlier, Victor Palmer had mockingly dismissed the map as a child's game. "Did you ever imagine it would lead to all this?" Eleanor asked, gesturing around at the gathering. Thomas smiled, thinking of his grandfather. "I think Ezekiel did. I think he knew exactly what he was setting in motion when he left that map for me to find." Frank nodded slowly. "Ezekiel always played the long game. He understood something most folks don't, that some seeds aren't meant to bear fruit in your lifetime." "That's what gives me hope about the work we're doing now," Eleanor said. "We might not see all the results, but we're planting seeds that will keep growing long after we're gone." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a surprise guest, United States Congresswoman Amara Kingsley, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Samuel Kingsley, who had flown in from Washington specifically for the closing night. "I wouldn't have missed this for the world," she told the hushed diner as she made her way to Thomas's table. "What happened here in Oakridge Valley isn't just my family's story. It's America's story. It's about who we were, who we are, and who we're still becoming." Recently elected as the first black representative from her district in Illinois, Congresswoman Kingsley had been instrumental in passing the National Historical Truth and Reconciliation Act, which provided funding and protection for communities undertaking projects similar to Oakridge Valley's. "My ancestor drew that map, hoping someone would find it someday," she continued, her voice carrying throughout the room. "But I don't think even he could have imagined what would grow from that simple act of truth-telling. What began in a farmer's barn has helped reshape how this nation confronts its past." The Congresswoman presented Thomas with a formal letter announcing that the Oakridge Valley Historical Center had been designated as the future site of the National Underground Railroad Research Institute, a federal institution that would coordinate research, education, and reconciliation efforts nationwide. "This isn't just a recognition of what you've accomplished," she explained, as Thomas read the letter with widening eyes. "It's an investment in the work that still lies ahead." The announcement was met with a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of Caroline's diner. As the celebration continued into the night, Thomas stepped outside for a moment, needing some quiet to process the magnitude of what had just been announced. The moon illuminated the town square, now home to a sculpture garden featuring works by artists interpreting different aspects of the Underground Railroad story. At the center stood a piece commissioned for the 5th anniversary, a life-sized bronze depicting a man studying a map, his face bearing an uncanny resemblance to both Thomas and his grandfather. "Quite a night, isn't it?" The voice belonged to Dr. Erica Chen, the current curator of the Historical Center and Eleanor's protégé. "Hard to believe it all started with you fixing a tractor." Thomas laughed. "That's what I keep saying. One minute I'm looking for a wrench, the next I'm running a national research center. Not exactly what you planned for your life," she observed. "No," Thomas agreed. "But then again, I don't think any of the most important journeys are ones we plan. Samuel Kingsley didn't plan to make Oakridge Valley a stop on the Underground Railroad. My grandfather didn't plan to become the guardian of that secret. And I certainly didn't plan to uncover it all. Yet here we are," Erica said, gesturing toward the diner where the celebration continued. "Here we are," Thomas echoed. "And you know what I've learned in these 10 years? The most powerful force for change isn't outrage or policy or even education, though all those matter. It's story. When people understand themselves as part of a larger story, something shifts. They start to see their choices differently." The next morning, as the visitors began departing and Oakridge Valley prepared to return to its new normal, Thomas made his traditional sunrise visit to the eastern field. It had become his ritual over the years, a quiet moment to reflect before the day began. The archaeological sites were silent in the early light, the dew glistening on the preserved foundations of what had once been hidden chambers and escape routes. Thomas walked slowly, retracing the path he had followed that first day with the map and metal detector, remembering his disbelief when the device had signaled something buried beneath the soil. At the final X, now marked by the glass enclosed memorial to Samuel Kingsley, he paused. The morning light filtered through the structure, casting a pattern of light and shadow that seemed to dance across the ground. 10 years, he said softly to the quiet field. "Thank you, grandfather. Thank you for trusting me with this." As he turned to leave, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small metal marker newly installed at the base of the memorial. It bore a simple inscription: "The seeds of truth may lie dormant for generations, but once planted in the right soil, they grow into forests that change the landscape forever." The quote was attributed to Ezekiel Bennett, dated 1954, the year Thomas was born. Back at the center, he found Eleanor in her office, packing up materials from the anniversary events. "Where did this come from?" he asked, showing her a photograph of the marker on his phone. Eleanor smiled mysteriously. "We found it among your grandfather's papers, a letter he wrote to you on the day you were born. It was sealed with instructions that it should be opened on the 10th anniversary of when Thomas finds what I've left for him. Mildred remembered it yesterday and insisted we have the marker made immediately." "He knew," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Somehow, he knew I would find the map, that all of this would happen. Not necessarily, Eleanor replied. I think he hoped. He planted a seed, not knowing if it would ever grow. That's what faith in the future looks like, doing the right thing without guarantees. As the day progressed, plans for the new National Institute began taking shape. Representatives from the Department of the Interior toured possible expansion sites. Architects consulted with Thomas about preserving the integrity of the original. Discoveries and researchers from universities across the country proposed collaborative projects. This feels overwhelming, Thomas confessed to Victor during a brief break. I'm a farmer, not a national institution director. Victor, whose own transformation from antagonist to ally remained one of the most remarkable aspects of the Oakridge Valley story, laid a hand on Thomas's shoulder. You know what my grandmother always says. We grow into the roles history assigns us. None of us expected to be here doing this work, but here we are. And the same courage that led you to dig that first hole will see you through whatever comes next. By evening, most of the visitors had departed, leaving Oakridge Valley unusually quiet after the bustling anniversary events. Thomas found himself back at his original farmhouse, still his home, though much of the surrounding land had been transformed into the historical center. Sitting on the porch where his grandfather had once told stories on summer evenings, Thomas reviewed the past decade through the lens of what had been accomplished and what remained to be done. The work of historical truth and reconciliation was never truly complete. New documents would surface, new connections would be discovered, new methodologies would emerge. Communities that had been inspired by Oakridge Valley were now developing their own innovative approaches, adapting the model to their specific histories and needs. What had begun as a personal discovery, a farmer finding a mysterious map, had expanded into something much larger than Thomas had ever imagined. The Oakridge Valley approach had been applied not just to Underground Railroad history, but to Japanese internment campsites in California, Native American boarding school records in South Dakota, and labor massacre memorials in West Virginia. The threads of hidden history once pulled revealed patterns across the American landscape, patterns of both oppression and resistance, of both cruelty and courage. Thomas's phone chimed with a message from Eleanor, the final attendance numbers. From the anniversary events, over 6,000 people had participated, representing 48 states and 12 countries. The youngest registered attendee was 9 years old, the oldest 98. More than 1,000 had signed commitments to begin similar projects in their own communities. As darkness fell, Thomas walked once more to the barn where it all began. Now, housing the primary exhibition hall, it had been carefully preserved to maintain its original character while accommodating its new purpose. The spot where Thomas had found the metal container was marked with a simple brass plaque. Here, on July 17, 2013, Thomas Bennett discovered a map that would change not just Oakridge Valley, but how America confronts its hidden histories. Standing in that sacred space, Thomas felt the weight of the decade, the resistances overcome, the alliances forged, the truths unearthed, and the healing begun. He thought of his grandfather, of Samuel Kingsley, of all those who had lived and died keeping faith with the future they would never see. We hoped we might catch you. The children have been studying Oakridge Valley all semester, and they've prepared some questions. Thomas smiled, setting aside the administrative tasks that awaited him. The most important work wasn't in reports or budgets, but in these moments, connecting young minds to the story that had transformed his life and community. "I'd be honored," he said, sitting down among the students. "What would you like to know?" A young girl raised her hand first. "Were you scared when you found out what the map really meant?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Yes," he admitted. "Truth can be frightening, especially when it challenges what we thought we knew. But I've learned that what waits on the other side of that fear is something precious, a clearer understanding of who we are and what we might become." Another student, a boy near the back, asked, "Do you think there are still important maps waiting to be found?" "Absolutely," Thomas replied without hesitation. "They might not be drawn on paper like the one I found. Some are written in documents locked away in archives. Others exist in stories passed down through families. Some are encoded in the land itself, in buildings, in landscapes, in places where significant things happened that we've chosen to forget. But they're all around us, waiting for someone curious enough, brave enough to follow where they lead." The final question came from a quiet girl who had been studying him intently throughout the session. "My grandmother says that healing can't happen without truth. Do you think that's right?" Thomas felt the weight of the decade in that simple question. All the resistance they'd faced, all the painful revelations, all the difficult conversations, and ultimately, all the reconciliation that had transformed individuals and the entire community. "Your grandmother is very wise," he said. "Truth without healing can be just another kind of wound. But healing without truth is just a bandage over an infection. It might look better for a while, but underneath, the damage continues." What we've tried to create here in Oakridge Valley is a place where truth and healing happen together, where bringing light to dark places isn't about assigning blame, but about finding a path forward. As the students departed for their tour, Thomas watched them. Young people for whom the Underground Railroad wasn't just a distant historical footnote, but a living story they could touch, see, and connect to their own lives. For them, Oakridge Valley wasn't about a dramatic discovery, but about the everyday courage required to face history honestly. That, perhaps, was the most significant transformation of all. Not the national recognition, not the academic contributions, not even the community healing. Important as all those were, the most profound change was in how future generations would relate to the past. Not as something fixed and distant, but as a living inheritance that required their active participation. As he walked through the center that morning, greeting staff and visitors, Thomas realized that what had begun with a single map had become something much greater. A new way of mapping the connections between past and present, between truth and reconciliation, between individual courage and community transformation. The land remembered, as his grandfather had always said. But more importantly, the people remembered too, not just what had happened, but what was possible when a community chose truth over comfort, understanding over ignorance, and healing over forgetting. And in that remembering lay the seeds of a different future, one where buried truths could rise to the surface, not as threats to be feared, but as opportunities for growth, where painful histories could be acknowledged without being repeated, and where the courage to face the past honestly could transform not just a single town, but an entire nation's understanding of itself. The map that Thomas Bennett found in his grandfather's metal container had started as a guide to hidden tunnels and safe houses. 10 years later, it had become something far more significant, a blueprint for how communities might navigate the most challenging terrain of all, the uncharted territories of truth, justice, and reconciliation that led not just to understanding the past, but to creating a more honest and hopeful future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.